Thank you all so much for coming tonight as we kick off this fantastic new series with John Martin Fisher. Let me introduce you to Professor Fisher. John Martin Fisher is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, and University Professor in the University of California. He was project leader of the Immortality Project, a $5.2 million grant from the John Templeton Foundation. Fisher has published widely on free will, moral responsibility, ethics, and the metaphysics and ethics of death and immortality, including this fantastic new book of his that I've now read twice, because if you survive a pandemic, you're required to read this book twice. Death, Immortality, and Meaning in Life, which is available right now from the Oxford University Press. It's a fantastic book. Extraordinarily enlightening, and Professor Fisher is right here. Nice to see you, sir. Nice to see you, John.
Thank you for inviting me back. I always enjoy either physically going to Palm Desert or being with you on Zoom, so thank you.
Well, it is my pleasure. It's always great fun to talk to you about the stuff that, I have to be honest with you, when I was a kid, literally kept me up at night. I was one of those kids in the 1970s growing up where I constantly was watching In Search Of, right? Hosted by Leonard Nimoy. And it was always about near-death experiences and outer body experiences and immortality and, you know, the quest for everlasting life. And it would both scare me and enervate me and then make me go to the Ouija board. And so now I don't need the Ouija board. I have an expert right here in front of me.
Now those things keep me awake at night.
Well, let me ask you a couple questions first, and then we're gonna show a video and we'll really get into it. But when did your interest in near-death experiences start?
Actually, it started only about 10 years ago. I had known that these phenomena existed. I'd heard about near-death experiences. I thought maybe they just were written about in books that you'd find in crystal stores and New Age shops, maybe Christian bookstores. But then when I got the grant, the John Templeton Foundation Immortality Grant, part of my job was to solicit project proposals, and then we had a competition to distribute money. We distributed a lot of money, millions of dollars, to scientists all over the world. And some of the projects were about near-death experiences. And I saw that pretty serious scholars and scientists were studying aspects of these experiences. So that got me interested, and I started reading not only their proposals, but I felt that I had to understand a little bit about them in order to evaluate all the proposals. So that started. It was only about a decade ago, and I've read quite a lot about them, but I'm a philosopher, so I basically come from the perspective of being a philosopher. Okay, so that's how I got interested.
So when you began your interest in this, did you assume that the science would convince you, or that the science would make you more of a skeptic? Where were you, at least initially, with your study of it?
Initially, I was skeptical that the experiences prove that heaven is for real, or that there is an afterlife. And then, as I looked more carefully, I saw that the phenomena are very rich and they're real. They really happen, and there are patterns in these experiences throughout our society, throughout the world, and throughout time. And they tap into something really deep in human nature, our fears and our hopes. And so I'm still a bit skeptical, spoiler alert, about whether they show much about an afterlife. But I'm not skeptical about the importance of near-death experiences. I've learned a lot about the lessons that they can teach us.
Well, and you mentioned this in your book, and you just mentioned it sort of a moment ago too, that they are real.
Yeah.
But it's the definition of real that is that area in between. Yeah. They happen for sure. People have these experiences, whether they are taking place on another plane of existence or in a flash of a second in their retina or somewhere else, that's the area of study, essentially, right?
Right. And what's interesting is for a long time, people even doubted that they take place. People tended to dismiss them. These are kooks, these are religious fanatics or new age crazy people. But it turns out they really do happen. And we know that they have patterns and similarities. And there's no question that they're real in that sense. But as you point out, we can ask about their proper interpretation. Are the people having near-death experiences really separating from their body and
Right.
being in a different realm? Do they then travel toward a heaven or even a hell, an
Right.
otherworldly realm? Is that literally true? So that's an interesting question. And I don't think it's a scientific question. I don't think it's a religious question. I think it's a human question.
Right.
And to some degree, a philosophical question. That's
Yeah.
why I think I'm capable of engaging in this debate. Some of the scientists wonder why they gave $5 million to a philosopher to study this. And literally, one of the MDs who writes about this has wondered out loud in various contexts, wasn't very friendly. But I think the point is, it's not just a medical issue. What I like to say is, I go to my doctor to ask him about my blood pressure, medication, or my blood work, or to check my heart. But I don't go to ask whether my soul separates from my body. And I
Right.
don't think my doctor is in a especially trained or to be an authority on that. They can tell me about my biological health, but
Mhm.
not my metaphysical status.
We need to find one of those people that can do that. That person be very, very rich.
Well, they're physicians, they're not metaphysicians.
Well, and that brings us actually to the video that we want to show, which is you have a clip from a gentleman who, in fact, is a neurosurgeon who sort of famously had a near-death experience. Do you want to set that up for us?
Nancy, please go ahead and play the video. And do we have audio too?
Experience, but neurosurgeon Eben Alexander never thought in 1,000 years he would be one of them. What did you think those were?
Fantasies, hallucinations.
He was a man of science. He didn't believe in it. That is, he says, until it happened to him. Let's talk about how you got sick. You woke up in the middle of the night feeling ill and in pain.
It was like being struck by a freight train. 4:30 in the morning, woke up, never had anything like that before. My last words to my wife, don't call 911. Trust me, I'm a doctor. It's just muscle spasm. And I was gone.
Dr. Alexander had a rare and deadly form of bacterial meningitis, which was infecting his brain. In a matter of hours, this healthy man was on death's door. By the time they got him to the hospital, he was in a coma. So your wife was being told that you might die?
And that she would be raising our 2 boys without me.
But as his body lay in that hospital bed with no recognizable brain activity, Dr. Alexander says he had already begun an astounding journey. A journey to a place he'd said didn't exist. Did you believe in heaven?
When I was younger, I thought a heaven and a loving God made sense. But through my academic neurosurgery career, I saw less and less that could be the case.
The journey began, he says, in a dark, formless place without memory, language, or time. But then
I was rescued from that by the spinning melody of light that came closer and opened up, and was a rip in the fabric of reality that just opened up around me.
You described this world as hyper vivid.
The colors were extremely vivid. Millions of butterflies. these flowers blooming, blossoms opening as we flew by.
And by his side, an unknown presence. There was a person guiding you, a beautiful girl, as you describe her. Can you tell me what she looked like?
She had a beautiful face with a wide smile and high cheekbones and absolutely gorgeous, clear blue eyes. She never said a word to me. She would look at me and the thoughts would come directly into my mind, into my awareness.
What
And the
thoughts?
thoughts were, you are loved, you are cherished. There's nothing you can do wrong. I always remember being told, we will teach you many things.
Back to the hospital where his wife kept her vigil and his doctors were giving up hope. On the 7th day of his coma, he opened his eyes.
It was just nothing but a miracle.
His first words, the very words he'd heard from his guide, that blue-eyed girl.
All is well. Don't worry, all is well.
Within weeks, Eben Alexander had made an astonishing full recovery.
How are you different after going through this experience?
Well, my family says I'm nicer. I would
That's a good
say,
thing.
really has changed me in every way by realizing that our souls are eternal.
The book he has written, Proof of Heaven, has sparked a lot of controversy.
You know you do have skeptics out there who are just saying it's not uncommon for people near death to have all sorts of funky things going on inside their bodies.
Well, that's why the fact that I had meningitis that was so severe, I mean, that should not have allowed for any experience. And this with the eyes just shows how
His brain was so completely bound that the visions he had could simply not regenerate again. He says he wrote down everything he remembered, now in his book, before speaking to anyone, so as not to taint his memory.
You then went on to read about other people's near-death experiences. Was it striking how similar what you had written was to what they had experienced?
It was absolutely astonishing.
I really felt the white light was God.
I stopped walking and I saw my grandma.
You could see peace, you could see love.
And all the other afterlife stories, everybody told of being guided by a loved one who had died. You had as your guide a girl you'd never met.
I must say that was very haunting. Why would I go through all that and not have my father there? My father, who was a neurosurgeon, I idolized him. And he passed over 4 years earlier. Why wasn't he there?
And why the blue-eyed girl instead? Dr. Alexander had been adopted as a child. Years later, he found his birth family, all except for one, his birth sister, who died before he met them.
Her name was Betsy.
How old was she when she died?
She was 36 years old.
So Betsy you'd never met?
I just heard what a beautiful, loving soul she was. How she worked at a crisis center and took care of many people who were unfortunate. And just very loving person.
How was it you came to see a picture of her?
My first sister Kathy had promised to send me a picture. It's about 4 months after I come out of the hospital when that picture arrived.
Opened the envelope and saw it for the first time. The photo, he says, was of that blue-eyed girl from his vision.
So stunning, and that picture is almost as if she's saying, "Here now." And I cannot tell you how powerful that was. There was no mistaking it. That's exactly who it was.
Life is back to normal at the Alexander household these days. There are soccer games to watch, dinners to be shared, grace to be said. But Dr. Alexander says he's on a mission now.
I hope to tell my story to everyone I possibly can around this world, because I think it will help this world to be a much better place.
Okay, we are back. As soon as I can get John to unmute, John.
I think I'm unmuted.
There you are. Okay, so that's a sort of fascinating story that he has. Here's a guy that theoretically knows the workings of the human brain. He is probably the last guy that we would expect to suddenly have this conversion. And you talk about him in your book as well. And the journey that he goes on, though, is very typical. It hits on a lot of very similar things throughout the culture. Talk a little bit about sort of the commonalities of near-death experiences in Western culture.
Right. They often involve an out-of-body experience where that is, it seems to the person as if she or he is floating above their body and they can see it. So their perspective is different from the one that's located in the body. Then quite often they're reunited with a deceased loved one, or they're joined by some kind of authority figure, perhaps a mentor or a religious figure, and that individual guides them toward some sort of guarded realm, or often it's a light at the end of the tunnel. So it's a guide from the darkness, typically toward the light. Often the colors are extremely vivid. It's not blurry and foggy like you might find in a dream. But I use the analogy of, it's not like the impressionistic painters so much as surrealists like Salvador Dali, very vivid. And it fits together, the story fits together, it's cohesive. And typically the individual wakes up just before they get to the guarded, gated community. It's almost as though heaven is a gated community in these
Vista del Boca.
Now, they differ, because in some cases, like in Aben Alexander's experience, he actually did get to a very blissful otherworldly realm, but often people wake up just before. And
right.
In his own experience, he was told, now you have to go back.
Right.
And sometimes the people report they're not happy to have to go back.
Well, and this is the interesting thing, is that, and you talk about this in your book, but also canonically, this is sort of what you hear, like there's a similar sort of message, right? You are at peace, you are loved, it's not your time, you have things left to do, you need to go back. Part of me thinks like, well, I hope if this happens to me, the dialogue isn't so cliched. Like, like I hope, like my mom and my dad were writers. I hope if I encounter them in my near-death experience, they have something more profound to say than "you were loved." Great, I got that in life. Tell me he's going to win the World Series.
I'm sure yours will be. I mean, he was only a neurosurgeon. Your parents were writers, and his father was a neurosurgeon. So maybe, it wasn't quite as creative.
But it's an interesting thing, right? Like it follows these lines, but then, and you talk about this in the book too, and this is, I think, is so fascinating, is that because we culturally have this metaphor of the light at the end of the tunnel as a symbol of hope, that's not the same in Eastern religion. It's not the same in Japan. And so what they experience in their near-death experience is the metaphor that they use.
Right. It's there's a story or trope in Japan of the desirability of buying a plot of land with your close friends, perhaps your family, toward the end of your life, and to tend this land as a rock garden. And that's very comforting as you approach death. And so often in near-death experiences in that culture, in Japan, they don't see a light at the end of the tunnel, they see a rock garden. And what's fascinating is these are stories of hope. And somehow our minds are able to grasp something that's hopeful and that's comforting, that's peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
And what's
Right.
also striking about this is there's a cultural aspect to these experiences, to the stories, as well as the biological. I think they're based in our brains, right? They're neurophysiologically based, but our culture and our personal experiences interact with that biology to create the stories that we report in near-death experiences.
Mhm. And through the history of near-death experiences, have the metaphors remained consistent, or have they changed as civilization has changed?
Well, the particular figures who appear, let's say, are going to be different. So in perhaps a Judeo-Christian context, there'll be Christian, for example, religious figures. In Hindu tradition, there'll be Hindu gods and goddesses. It's different depending, the particularities are going to be different depending on the specific religious background and culture. But the overall patterns are very similar. An out-of-body experience, a journey guided by a mentor toward something unknown, but something beautiful and hopeful. It's a journey from the known to the unknown, guided by a loving mentor. And that resonates with us. That kind of story resonates deeply.
And the interesting thing for me, I mean, there's a lot, but the first, just to sort of touch on your broader area of study too, is that the notion of the near-death experience and the notion of the afterlife is also the notion of immortality. That if we're having near-death experiences, that's showing us that there's a possibility of this afterlife. And if this afterlife exists, that tells us that we can live forever, at least in some sort of form. And is that, I mean, that seems to me the existential trick of the mind that we have to not constantly live in fear of our own demise.
Good. They're very fascinating stories. I mean, this is why, as I studied them more and more, I saw their richness, and they continue to fascinate me, and they're multidimensional. I think that human beings are afraid of death. It's not just an original idea with me. Famous going back to Freud and others, and in the 20th century to Ernest Becker in his book, The Denial of Death. It's the idea that we are afraid of death, and much of what we do then in our personal lives, in our religious lives and so forth, is to manage that fear of death. He called it terror management. So I think we're afraid of death, and we look for ways of kind of managing that fear. And one way of doing it is to convince ourselves that we will not die. We'll live forever in some way or another, and we'll be reunited with our loved ones, and everything will be peaceful and wonderful. So the way I sometimes put it is there's a formula: terror management plus confirmation bias gives us supernaturalism. So sorry about that. But the idea is we want to manage our fear of the unknown and of death. Some of us are only a little bit anxious and we don't think about it, but others are really terrified of death. And then we ignore evidence. Let's say we look for positive reasons, positive evidence on behalf of the afterlife, and we ignore countervailing or objections to that evidence. We focus on the positive, we ignore the negative. That's called confirmation bias. And those two things work together, terror management and confirmation bias, so that we interpret our experiences and the stories, the reports of others, in a way that comforts us, that gives us hope. Okay, I hope that, I don't know if that answered the question.
It does, because I think that, so I'm not a religious person. And so I didn't believe in an afterlife until I fell in love. You know, love precludes you from feeling like that thing can never end. And so you begin to have the sort of magical thing.
Yeah.
Right. And so it makes me wonder too, with the near-death experiences, is there in your study, are they more often occurring to folks who are religious, or people who have no religion, or is it across the spectrum?
It's across the spectrum, but, and now I have not done a careful empirical study, but in my reading, I would say most of the experiences occur in people who either are religious or have been exposed to religion in the sense of growing up with it. Eben Alexander, at the time of his experience, was not really a religious person. He had grown up in a Christian family, and he even expresses, interestingly, in the book, the fact that he always wanted to believe, but he couldn't really get himself to believe. And so there are a lot of people who have grown up in a Jewish family or perhaps a Christian family, a Catholic family, but the views didn't ever really convince them. And so many of them have these experiences, but famous atheists have had them as well. There are a lot of atheists. Alfred Ayer, the famous philosopher who was an atheist, famously had a near-death experience that he wrote about. So, and some people actually convert, but many do not.
And there also seems to be the kind of near-death experience that also seems to have a more paranormal side to it. And you talk about this a bit in the book, and I think we're all familiar with it from TV and that sort of thing, where someone is hovering above their body and they hear the conversations of the doctors, or there's the famous case that you mentioned of a man whose dentures go missing and he knows where they are because he saw the nurse put the dentures away.
Right.
The outer body experience actually seems to, for me, make more sort of scientific sense than the near-death experience, because I always feel like there's the high probability that our brains are like Siri and they're always listening and at some level are always paying attention.
Yeah.
Is that correct, or am I just making an assumption?
Well, it's interesting because many, if not most, near-death experiences do contain an out-of-body experience. And then after many of these, we call them NDEs, or people who have experienced an NDE type experience, they report things that people can't quite see how they discovered these things. They have information that shouldn't have been available to them, and they report it like, okay, when I was unconscious, the nurse put my dentures in that drawer. Or when I was unconscious and being operated on, the surgeon asked the staff, the nurse, for another scalpel or whatever it was. And it turns out that these reports are true. And so that's one of the fascinating parts of near-death experiences. They sometimes they're about realms where there are butterflies and so forth, or in Todd Burpo's book about his son, Colton Burpo, called Heaven is for Real. I mean, people are familiar with Eben Alexander's experience, Proof of Heaven. They're also familiar with the Colton Burpo story, a young boy who had a burst appendix when he was close to 4 years old, and his father was a minister, and he reported when he recovered, fortunately, that he had met with Jesus and so forth. People are familiar with these stories, but they are perhaps on the extreme end of being somewhat sensational, and the scholars of near-death experiences, the more academic scholars and medical scholars, don't particularly like focusing on those. But those stories are not verifiable. You can't verify whether there was this realm with the butterflies. But if I say the nurse put my dentures in that drawer, that is verifiable. And then that yields this puzzle. How could this person have known that? And so I should just say there's a lot of debate about those reports, and some people are really taken by them. Some people think these thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of reports of people who've been unconscious, and they then report truly some piece of information that they could only have gotten if they were out of their body. To them, that constitutes strong evidence of the fact that the mind separates from the body. Others of us would try and find other explanations, more naturalistic explanations for how the individuals got the information. I'll just quickly mention one of the projects we supported in the Immortality Project. It's led by Sam Parnia, an MD who started in the UK, but then went to the State University of New York at Stony Brook and is now at NYU Medical School. He has this ongoing experiment where he puts computer screens in the rooms of intensive care, cardiac intensive care units, where people are brought in and they're unconscious. And then these screens are not visible by ordinary perception from where the patients are, and they flash numbers, randomly flash numbers. And when the people come to, some of them do, some of them don't, but when the people do awaken, then they're asked whether they saw, and they don't volunteer that they saw the number, then they're asked about that. And this is a way of trying more scientifically to determine whether this out-of-body phenomenon actually occurs. But one thing he told me, because we got to know each other through the grant, he said that he had to be very careful because in the initial ways of doing the experiment, the nurses would secretly tell the patients what the numbers were because they were so desperate. This is really terror management, they're so desperate that it'd come out. But that's a little strange because at some point, didn't a little voice tell them, you're cheating, you're cheating?
Right.
In any case, there is work on this, some of which is serious empirical work on whether people actually leave their bodies. One more thing, out-of-body experiences can be induced by various physical means, like fighter pilots experiencing a lot of G forces can have that. And there was a scientist, Olaf Blanc is his name, in Switzerland, who was treating people with certain kind of epilepsy by stimulating a specific part of their brain electronically, and that induced out-of-body experiences. So you can have them, you can also have them as a result of psychedelic drugs.
Right.
So they are, first of all, they are very real in the sense that they can be induced in a lot of ways, and people report that it seems as if they're floating above their body. That's what we call an out-of-body experience. Is it literally true that they are floating? That's a different story. It's like if I ask you, you say when you wake up, I had this dream, and the dream involved my going to San Francisco and finding this great restaurant. And so that really happened. I'm willing to take you at your word. That really happened. But did it really? The dream really happened. But did you really go to San Francisco? That's a different question.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because you touch on this too about when in the actual experience this is happening. So just like you can have a dream and it feels like you've been dreaming for 11 hours, but it might be 4 minutes that you had this dream.
Right, exactly. This is an important point. This is crucial in understanding and evaluating that video. And he said that all of this happened, that these experiences happened while he was totally incapable of having any consciousness, where he showed you on the screen the picture of his brain.
Right.
And he, as a neurosurgeon, tells you, I couldn't have been having these experiences. My brain wasn't functioning in a way that would support consciousness. So I must have been separated. My mind must have separated from my brain. But what he doesn't really mention is that many people think that, like in a dream where a lot of the brain activity is right as you're ramping up from sleep to consciousness, the same thing might be happening just as your brain is awakening from this comatose state, this lack of consciousness. As the brain is ramping up, it could be having being in a set of brain states. There's brain activity that represents to you that you had these experiences, but the brain events are actually taking place as you're waking up. So to put it simply, there's no way that he can prove, or that anyone can prove, that his experiences were had when his brain was offline. There's just no, and almost every scientist, and I have read about this, almost every scientist, though I'm not a scientist, let me emphasize that, but the scientists say there's no evidence that you can have experiences after when your brain is totally offline and can only do the basic housekeeping tasks. What they believe is happening is as the brain is starting to be more active, like you're waking up for a dream, then you can have these experiences. The experiences tell you that they occurred long ago, but that's not true. So anyway, that's a big problem with that video.
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting, or one of course, millions of interesting things about this is that we're unreliable narrators to our own experience.
Right.
That our brain is lying to us about where we are in time and space. And I always think about a friend of mine, the late writer Barbara Saranella. She was in a coma for 3 weeks, and when she got out of it, she was really kind of bummed because she really enjoyed being in a coma. Because she said to me, it was great because I was in a ski lodge and I could hear all the conversations of all the people surrounding me, and they didn't know I was listening to them, but I could hear them, and I was warm and I was happy and I was sitting in a really comfortable chair. It was the best ski lodge I've ever been in. Yeah. I was like, that's not a bad way to go through having liver transplant and being in a coma for 2 weeks.
Right. No, they're often very pleasant. Now, some of them are unpleasant. So people do have really unpleasant, negative near-death experiences.
Right.
They're probably underreported because who wants to admit that they're the bad, the kind of person who would have a negative near-death experience? But ideally, I mean, I think they're very parallel because in a positive experience, you're going from the dark toward the light. You're being guided by a mentor who's loving and has your interests at heart. Now, and it's very transformative. That's something we haven't mentioned, that near-death experiences typically are transformative. People become less anxious about death, more pro-social, more caring about other people, more chill, as it were. But the negative ones are also guided by someone, and they're from usually the light down toward the darkness, but you're supposed to be learning as you go. You're not actually depicted as suffering, but you're in the story, you're witnessing other people's suffering. And your guide is basically trying to get you to see that something about your life has gone wrong and you need to reflect and you need to change. So they can be very educative. Another feature that, there's so many things that we can't really discuss in such a short time, but another feature of near-death experiences is the life review. So it's like your life passes before you. And that can be very illuminating. It can really cause you to change. And one of the scientists we supported told of a patient of his who had a near-death experience, and part of it was a life review in which he saw that he was really unfaithful, or at least bad to his woman friend, and it caused him to see that and caused him to change. So the positive ones and the negative ones can be transformative, and they can all kind of be something that leads to improvements in our life.
So one last thing I wanted to touch on, and then we're going to start taking some questions for the audience, is sort of a parallel to the near-death experience, which is the experiences of people who have survived falling from great heights, which you talk about in your book, where they remember falling, and they have many of the same sort of experiences as they are plummeting to their survival. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, one thing that definitely happens is that we are so wired that we can become extremely calm and in control and strong in a near-death circumstance, in a case where you're about to fall, or you have fallen, or you've slid off the ice in the evening on an icy road. You can suddenly cope in this incredible way. And it's definitely a survival advantage. It's the keep calm, and carry on part of us. We also have the fight or flight part, and they kind of work together to provide a survival advantage for us. But what I think is that, this doesn't exactly answer the question, but this keep calm and carry on ability that we have, the ability where time slows down and you can do things you couldn't otherwise do. The stories of a parent who sees their child pinned underneath a car and can actually lift the car. Well, I think that what the best way to understand near-death experiences are as side effects of that we have that ability when we're conscious and aware to survive very difficult, challenging circumstances in which our lives are in jeopardy. We have these capacities. Now, sometimes when we're unconscious, we have these experiences that are kind of a side effect of that. It doesn't help us when we're unconscious.
Right.
We can't really stay calm and carry on. You can't do anything. But how to explain them? They're what's sometimes called an evolutionary spandrel. A spandrel is a term from architecture, but it was borrowed by Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin, two famous biologists. And what they said was sometimes evolution favors something, and something else comes along for the ride. That something else isn't necessarily advantageous, but it's like a side effect.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes an unwanted side effect. And there's a famous church, St. Mark's Church in Venice, where these spandrels exist. And the reason they exist is the architect wanted some other beautiful thing, and they had to put up with the spandrels. So it's like an unwelcome side effect. And the last thing I want to say is, I think of near-death experiences as a welcome side effect, because they are a side effect of something that's evolutionarily advantageous.
Right.
Carry on, be strong, don't panic, don't freak out. And that helps us.
Right.
Okay. But then as a side effect of that, we have these experiences, and they're welcome because they are educative. There are stories of hope, and they're stories of love. And I agree with Abe and Alexandra about this. Almost all of them involve a loving mentor who accompanies us on that part of our journey. And so that's one of the beautiful things about them. They teach us this example of this lesson of the importance of love.
Right. I'm curious, and then we're going to take these questions here. We've got a bunch of them, so this is a quick one. Have you encountered anyone in your reading or in your study who's had more than one near-death experience?
Oh, yes. Yeah, well, I encountered them on the internet. When I look up near-death literature, sometimes it'll pop up as stories. And sometimes, actually, this one there is an organization called the International Association of Near-Death Studies. IANS is their acronym. They're headquartered in Santa Barbara, and they have a website. They sponsor a journal, and they kind of are a support group for people who've had near-death experiences, and they sponsor scholarship about them. They have a website, and I was referred to that website by the head of the organization, and one of their videos is a discussion, and people reported having dozens of near-death experiences.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
I don't know exactly why that would be. I think
they work in the circus.
Yeah, they're humanities professors.
They're assassins.
Professors worried about their jobs. Well, what I would say also is people differ about whether you want to describe experiences that are not even in near-death context as near-death experiences. Some people have similar phenomena, similar experiential content, even if they're not really in a situation where their life is in jeopardy. So I can't believe that these people were in dozens of situations where their life really was in jeopardy, but it might be that stress and trauma and anxiety induce these experiences in some people. They can be induced in various different ways.
Right. Okay, let's take some questions here. We've got a bunch. So JD asks, I'm curious about how NDEs are experienced in cultures where the belief in reincarnation is more prevalent.
Interesting. Well, there definitely, like I say, there are studies of NDEs in India, and there are, and in those NDEs, there are Hindu gods and goddesses. I don't know, let's see, to be honest, I don't know the details of those NDEs. I do know Buddhists, of course, everybody has near-death experiences, and the Buddhists have studied them very carefully, and they've studied for millennia the phenomena and experiences associated with dying. They've given very careful analyses. And in fact, the Dalai Lama was once on a panel with Eben Alexander, and the Dalai Lama, in his gentle, nice way, expressed a certain amount of skepticism about the story that Eben Alexander was telling, because they've been studying these phenomena for years and for thousands of years. But I should stop and just say, frankly, I don't know the details of the NDEs of people who do believe in reincarnation.
Okay. There's a couple questions about near-death experiences and experiences induced by LSD and things like that. And you talk about that a bit in your book. Can you talk a little bit about that, the sort of crossover between the two?
Yeah. Oliver Sacks, in his book Hallucinations, talks about a young man who gave him a report of an experience on LSD, a trip. It's interesting they call it a trip. And the phenomena were exactly the same, almost exactly the same as the ones in a near-death experience, an out-of-body experience, a kind of traveling toward a light, a sense of peace, a transformation. It was just striking. I do quote it in my book. And so one of the things, the points there is, you don't really need to be in touch with an otherworldly realm or a heaven in order to have these experiences. You could have them as a result of your brain being stimulated or taking a psychedelic drug. So it's not the case that the only explanation of near-death experiences is being in touch with a heavenly realm. It's just not. Well, that's possible, but there are other ways we can explain it. Well, the way I look at it is all of these are spiritual experiences. Near-death experiences are a kind of spiritual experiences, just like experiences induced by LSD or psilocybin or other psychoactive substances can be spiritual experiences. And going back to the great philosopher and psychologist, William James, who was Henry James' brother, the famous novelist, William James, at the turn of the 20th century, wrote an excellent essay called The Varieties of Religious Experiences, and he talked about the characteristics of the typical spiritual experience, and they're exactly the way these near-death experiences go. And in fact, he talked about the ultra-real quality. That's one of the chapter names in Eben Alexander. It was real, it was ultra real. And that's the way spiritual experiences present themselves. William James called it the noetic quality of these experiences. So I would call psychedelics and LSD experiences one kind of spiritual experience that does share quite a lot with the NDEs. And I think it is interesting that just as you have a voyage guided by a loved one in a near-death experiences, the hallucinogens are often called trips. So.
Right. And, you know, there's also, in these situations where someone has been in a horrific accident or they've had a stroke or whatever, their brain chemistry, of course, is going crazy, but they're also being pumped full of painkillers and hallucinogens and all these other things. So the relationship seems to, you know, just in terms of a chemical reaction, seems somewhat likely.
Yeah, very complicated and interesting. And people have tried to figure out whether the pain pills are causing these experiences or exacerbating or changing. Well, most people think that's not the case, but what is the case is there are certain chemicals that are naturally occurring, and they are the DMT, I think, is one of them. Is that correct? But there's a naturally occurring chemical that is in higher concentrations in the blood of people having near-death experience, and they are hallucinogens. They're natural hallucinogens, which is kind of interesting. But I wrap it up in the bow of spiritual experiences and how they're all kind of similar. And okay.
Okay, we've got a good complex question here from Jeanette. Jeanette says, I'm interested in the cultural patterns potentially underlying or influencing the images that reappear in such near-death experiences. In Dante's Divine Comedy, Roman poet Virgil guides Dante through purgatory and hell, whereas an ideal beautiful woman, Beatrice, guides him through heaven. So perhaps our neurosurgeon knew his Dante. You know, where does that play a role, do you think?
Yeah, he knew his Dante, but not his sister.
Not his sister.
Well,
right.
Yeah, it's definitely the case that your upbringing, your culture, the information that you're in contact with, the stories that you're telling and you've been told are important in setting the content, the parameters and the content of near-death experiences. As I said, the abstract patterns are similar, but the particulars are going to be different. What I would say, I mean, this brings up this very difficult question of the meaning of the role of the biological sister in Eben Alexander's experience. How do we explain that exactly? And one thing that you said many interesting things, Todd, but one thing that really struck me was how unreliable we are about the world. You know, testimony is notoriously unreliable, but it's even more challenging when we're looking inside ourselves and trying to understand and interpret our experience. And it strikes me that one thing that might have happened was that Eben Alexander had these experiences. He clearly did have the experiences. When exactly they took place, that's more controversial. But then when he awakens and later he was shown this picture of his biological sister, he then read back into and interpreted his whole experience in light of this photo. Now, why did he see a blue-eyed girl in his near-death experience prior to actually seeing that photo? I'm not sure, but we'd have to look more carefully. It might be, though he had never met his biological sister, and he does say he'd heard that she was a very loving person.
Right.
Like she worked at a rape counseling center. She loved people, helped people. Now, might someone have said, and she had these beautiful blue eyes?
Right.
No, I don't know. So just the fact that he hadn't met her doesn't imply that he didn't have stories about her. As a matter of fact, he admits that. So his I'm sorry, that question reminded me of that point about the video. But the simple answer to the complex question is yes, we're definitely influenced almost by our culture and our upbringing and our relationships. I think of it as like the mind in general, and think of emotions or thoughts or moods like anxiety or depression. I mean, depression is partly biological, but it's not all biological. It has to do with the way you frame your experiences, your relationships, your past. And we know now that just treating depression with medicines doesn't really work as well as addressing psychodynamic issues, and along with the biological issues. Mental states in general are a matter of, you know, your culture and the framework that you bring to the experience, as well as the biology. So that's the way I think it is with near-death experiences. And the reason that's relevant to the question is it's undeniable that the literature you've read, the religion you've been involved with, the education, the models that your mentors and your parents show, clearly they affect the content of the near-death experience.
So the last thing, and then people can spend literally the rest of their lives reading about this. And let me hold up your book again real quick. This we've touched on about 1/1,000,000th of what John talks about in this amazing book, and it's incidentally eminently readable, and you'll be quoting it for the rest of your life as well. I go around talking about terror management because of this book. I'm interested in one of the questions also is interested in this, which is the relationship between just a normal dream state and the near-death experience. And part of this is related to what the gentleman had with the blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman. Our minds are filled with neurological character actors. You know, our dreams are, ooh, that was a good line. I should remember that one. Our dreams are filled with people we've never met before.
Right.
And so what is has there been a study of those two things together? Is the brain doing similar things, or is it completely different?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and reminds me of the Jungian theory, Carl Jung, of archetypes, where and followed by Joseph Campbell and his work on mythology, that we have these archetypes, these figures wired into us, like the mother, the father, and so forth. And everybody interprets their experience in part in light of this framework of these structures, you could say, abstract structures. And even though, I mean, a lot of them are just there already in our minds, and we don't get them from experience, and they're just a way of interpreting experience. And I don't know, frankly, whether anybody has done any studies about the content of near-death experience as it relates to that kind of Jungian psychotherapy, or that idea that there are these ideas in our minds that maybe have neural correlates that are stored in our brains, and that our myths and legends crystallize, and somehow in a near-death experience it rattles the cage a little bit and brings those out. Or it's like you have a filing cabinet, or and there's a little earthquake and it dumps some of the file folders out that otherwise were not accessible to. I don't know, and that would be interesting. I mean, one of the fun things about this whole literature is that not only is it humanly interesting, but it's really intellectually interesting. And a lot of it is new because up until about 20 years ago, just about every serious scientist or scholar kind of dismissed this, like I started by talking about. But now it's taken seriously, and it should be taken seriously, because people are not confabulating, or they're not lying, or they're not just making stuff up for attention. Some of that does exist. But in general, the phenomena need to be respected, and the people need to be respected. And people now, serious people, are now doing scholarship, some of which we gave millions of dollars to. So.
Well, and you ask a great question in the book, which is, what's more likely, that we don't have the science yet to figure out what's happening, or that this is a purely supernatural experience, or a combination of those things, right?
I'm not on the science myself. I mean, but I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, one thing I believe is that there's a difference between explanation, perhaps, and understanding. We can explain near-death experiences by science. Ultimately, we don't have it yet, but we're looking for, just like with cancer, we don't have a full explanation of all the forms of cancer. We want to be able to explain scientifically what happens. But now to understand them is to grasp something more than just the science. They have a kind of meaning that speaks to us, to our emotions, and that's a different kind of exercise. The exercise of trying to understand them in their emotional impact, and that won't just be by science. Right. But I don't think we should throw science out the door. I mean, obviously, science marches on, and sometimes it gets stuck for a while, and sometimes it goes backwards, but it makes progress. So the fact that we don't have a full scientific explanation of what happens in the brain when you have a near-death experience, that doesn't mean that you give up on science.
Right. Well, folks, let me hold up John's book one more time. It is Death, Immortality, and Meaning in Life by John Martin Fisher. It's from the Oxford University Press. If you go onto Amazon right now, you can get a copy of it. You should buy 20, 30 copies. The holidays are coming up. This is what you want to talk about at Hanukkah and Christmas. I'm telling you, we survived a plague. Don't you want to know the meaning of life?
Very appropriate for Halloween too.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an amazing conversation, John. I could talk to you forever about all of this stuff. But fortunately, we have a full series with you coming up over the course of this academic year. So John's going to be talking about a variety of topics related to some of the stuff that's in this book. So if you are on our mailing list, you'll be hearing about it more as the academic year goes on. So thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I hope you had a good time. A video of this will be on YouTube probably in a couple of weeks, so you can share it with your friends and family, talk about my hair, talk about how smart John is, all that good stuff. And John, thank you again so much. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.